This is as good a time as any to start. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's spARO virtual mentoring session on publishing. There's a message in the chat that I won't say word for word, but as Zoom is, there's always a chance that there might be some audio or video lag or disruption. If you have any technical issues, please send an email to headquarters@aro.org. And this session has live closed captioning at the bottom of the screen. Zoom provides this live transcription that must be enabled by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. It is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, Dr. Barbara Shinn-Cunningham and Dr. Allison Coffin. A brief introduction for both. Dr. Shinn-Cunningham trained as an electrical engineer at Brown University and received a master's and PhD at MIT. In 2018, she became the inaugural director and professor of the Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, where she holds the Cohen Chair in Auditory Neuroscience. She also holds courtesy appointments in psychology, biomedical engineering, and electrical and computer engineering. Before joining Carnegie Mellon, Dr. Shinn-Cunningham spent 21 years on the faculty at Boston University in biomedical engineering. She is currently the treasurer of ARO and has been elected to offices in the Acoustical Society of America, ASA. She is deeply committed to creating an open, inclusive, and supportive research environment and has won mentorship awards from the Society for Neuroscience and the ASA. An author of more than 200 scientific articles, she is recognized for her expertise in spatial hearing, auditory attention, and hearing deficits. Dr. Shinn-Cunningham's research combines behavioral experiments, brain imaging like EEG, MEG, and fMRI, computational, and other methods to develop realistic, physiologically based models of auditory processing and to understand the mechanisms important when listening in everyday settings.
I'm sorry, we're out of time now.
Well, there's...
Yeah, see, Barb, if you weren't so accomplished, we could have gotten, we made progress.
If I weren't so old, Allie, if I weren't so old.
Your words, not mine. I'd never call you that. Besides, you once taught me how to eat a lobster. I am forever in your debt.
That wasn't included, goodness. In addition, no. Dr. Allison Coffin is an associate professor of neuroscience at Washington State University, Vancouver, where her lab focuses on hair cell damage, protection, and regeneration. She is broadly trained in comparative and evolutionary biology with degrees in marine biology from Florida Tech, fisheries master from the University of Minnesota, and a biology PhD from the University of Maryland. She's now the co-editor-in-chief of the Springer Handbook, an auditory research series, also known as the Green Books, and welcomes ideas for new volumes. Dr. Coffin is also the chair of the 2024 Gordon Research Conference on the Auditory System, and outside of the auditory field, she is the co-founder and president of the Association of Science Communicators, formerly Science Talk, the professional organization that empowers science communicators to expand their communication potential and impact the world. Small plug also for the Science Communication Workshop happening in Orlando for the midwinter meeting. Allie loves reading YA fiction, motorcycling, cats, and dancing. Come find her at the Hairball. Thank you both so much for your time, and I'm excited for the discussion that we will have, aided by the questions and inquiries of everyone in attendance about the publishing process, manuscripts, journals, all that fun stuff. I guess to kick us off, I'd ask a general question of, with the amazing amount of experience that you both have, do you now have a standard approach when you decide that something is ready for publication? And how has that evolved over the years?
Good question. Barb, you want to take that one first?
Yeah,
Yeah. That 200 plus publications. So yeah.
it's funny. I don't think I have thought about that ever before. It feels to me like when I'm working with, at this point in my career, first of all, I rarely write a paper by myself. It's always with a student or a trainee or somebody who's actually the person whose story it is, probably going to be first author. And a lot of it's working with them and getting to the point that we both agree that there's a story that we understand. And it may not answer all the questions, but there's at least a point that we want to make with the paper, and that the data are telling the story and the data support what we want to claim. So, and it's funny, the thing that I have thought a lot about is, which is related actually, is kind of the order in which I have people do things. And specifically, the first thing I want to see is, what are the figures? What are the figures? Because if the figures don't tell the story, then you don't really have a story. Like that is what people will glance at. That is what is the thing that is most convincing. And once that's done, then you can, and along in parallel, you can be writing the methods. That's kind of boring and straightforward. You could probably get ChatGPT to do it now because it's pretty straightforward. There's no interpretation. It's just the facts. And similarly, results come, once you have all the figures, all you have to do in results is describe that. Mm-hmm. And then comes the fun part of interpreting it, which is the discussion section. And personally, I don't write the introduction to a paper until I've done those other things in that order, because now I understand, now I really have clear in my head what it is that this paper does and what it references and what gaps it fills, because I now have that whole story laid out. So if those pieces are in place, the paper's done, but I don't really do it in a sequential order. I do it in that kind of inverted order because it is all in the data. And as scientists, we need to be driven by the data.
Yeah, and I take a similar approach, and similarly to Barb, it's not, I'm sitting down to write a paper. Occasionally, if it's a collaborative project in my lab has a lot of undergraduates and postbac technicians as well as graduate students. And so sometimes I might be the one drafting a paper that has 5 or 6 undergraduates who have all contributed and who are all co-authors, but no one of them is in a position to write the first draft, although I will still have them put together the methods and results section for the portion that they did, just like what Barb was saying. But some of the strategy that we've really kind of coalesced on over the last several years is, first of all, in lab notebooks, and yes, we still have paper notebooks as well as having things in the cloud on Teams, is as an experiment is completed, of basically writing up a mini version of that. You could almost think of it like a lab report back in school days of, here's a couple of sentence introduction of why I did the experiment. What was the question I was asking for that experiment? Couple sentences of methods, and then of just the main methods, not details, but here's the approach that I took. Here's the graph. Here's a few sentence interpretation. And now here's what I'm going to do next. And so I'll ask for that in the notebook as we go. So also when we're sitting down to write a paper, a lot of those pieces are already there in draft form. And similarly, like what Barb was saying for starting with the figures, absolutely. And we'll start usually by storyboarding those out. So either literally on a physical piece of paper with sticky notes or drawn on a whiteboard. A lot of times I'll get the group together that's working on a paper. Might be just myself and a graduate student. Usually it's going to be a larger team, maybe that graduate student and the technician or undergraduate that was working with them. And we'll just come up to the whiteboard and storyboard out, like here are each figure. And this is before we even have all the data. We've got some of the data. Now let's put this into figure 1. What's the story that we'd like to tell with figure 1 based on the data that we have? Okay, now based on the data that we have, like usually we'll do this a few figures in, but what are the kinds of experiments we're planning? So we don't necessarily know what the data are going to show yet, but what are the experiments we have so far? How do they fit together? And where, based on maybe being partway through the project, where do we have the gaps? Like what other experiments are missing? And I also find that storyboarding the figures out like that and then saying, oh, right, we have this experiment where we've used this kind of genetic and pharmacologic manipulation to alter this cell death pathway and hair cells or whatever it is. Oh, hey, now there's a hole that we just identified in the story because we started putting the figures together, just scratching them out on a whiteboard with a marker, that we can then go on to do those experiments. So a lot of it really is this kind of iterative process of let's start to put the story together long before we have all of it and identify what those holes are. And also I find it's easier to work towards a goal when you have a vision of what that product is going to look like. And to be honest, strictly from a very practical perspective, in terms of, are we going to put this together into a big story that we're spending 3-4 years on, or is it maybe a couple of smaller chunks that are still standing on their own? Some of that is, does the graduate student need to finish? Have they done enough that this is an appropriate body of work for a dissertation or a master's thesis? Because I often have master's students as well. And to be perfectly honest, do we need to put paper out so that we can then refer to that publication in our next grant? So there is some of that strategic thinking as well about what do we need as a product that we can refer to continue the work.
That's a really excellent answer. I also love the idea that it can start as early as the lab book, rather than you go through a lot of the motions and then there's a hurdle for, oh, how do I turn this into suddenly a finished scientific paper? Because the real process is it keeps building on what you do.
And the hardest thing is sitting down and staring at an empty screen and saying, oh crap, I have an empty screen. What do I stick on it? If you start with bits and pieces in a lab notebook, individual graphs, but with some even like chicken scratch, here's the ideas, here's the interpretation. Also, then when you sit down and write the discussion, as Barb was saying, you've already got some of those hints as you've been going.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing worse than feeling like you don't know where to start.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that inverse process, I'm not as organized as Allie. You know, I've never been good about keeping lab notebooks myself. I'm just a chaotic person generally. So,
I love your chaos.
Yeah, I mean, there's some creativity in chaos, but it's not for everyone. But that is kind of a truth about my lab, and you know that does work well. But the way we manage that kind of being too overwhelmed is by doing the figures, and actually the process is very much as Allie's. We don't quite, you know, maybe have as many stages of storyboarding or whatever, but if you make a figure and it's not convincing, it makes you realize what else you need to show to get the story out.
Yeah, the storyboarding side for me comes from my background in science communication. And really from the technique was introduced to me by a former PhD student, Alex Hudson, who, you think I'm organized? Forget it. She used to go to PlannerCon every year. I didn't even know that was a thing. It was amazing. She would come back and do a whole lab meeting on organizational tools to help us improve. And
awesome.
She taught me storyboarding for talks and posters, and it's brilliant, and it works really well for figures for papers as well.
That's really great. I'd be a bit scared if I was ever on the programming committee for a PlannerCon. I feel like it's
yeah, because if you don't get it right, you've got a lot of type A organized people that are going to be annoyed.
Yeah. We have a great question in the chat from Elise A. How do you decide where to publish? As someone new to publishing, PhD student, without a lot of track record, do you aim high and learn from rejection, or do you go for a journal that you're confident in about your work?
I'm going to jump in on this one. I'll answer the second part because I think that like you should, where you publish matters much more than it should, but it's a game. There's one of my lab quotes. We kind of keep track of random things people say that are sort of funny out of context. And a lab quote that stuck with me for years now is getting into one of those journals, those high profile journals. It's a beauty contest. It has nothing to do with the quality of the science. It's whether the science seems sexy to the person who's the desk editor who either rejects it outright or not, right? And if you don't try, you're not going to get in. And you don't lose a lot of time by trying, honestly. And now most places do, you know, we use bioRxiv now all the time, or, you know, PsycArchive or whatever. and have preprints out all the time anyhow. So it's not like you're going to get scooped. You might as well try, and you have nothing to lose other than your ego. And the question of, do you learn from rejection? I still don't learn from rejection. I just get annoyed and frustrated and feel terrible for the next 3 days, even if I know it's a long shot and I shouldn't, be upset. But, you've got to learn to deal with rejection as just part of science. So much of what we do in science is to get negative feedback. It's rare to get positive feedback. And, in my lab, I try and counter that by being positive with my trainees and students to cushion them from the reality that all of the other things that they will hear are all the things wrong with their paper, even if it's a great paper. Even if it's just grammar comments, like it feels very personal after you put so much hard work into things, and you just have to learn to buffer yourself and take it and process it and forget about it.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of publishing, I'll admit I've been maybe a little bit conservative in where I've submitted some papers, but the strategy very much has been, where do I think it's appropriate? Maybe aiming a bit high. I'll admit I've never submitted something to Science or Nature, at least not yet. Got a couple of things in the works that hopefully will be a reasonable story for there, but you never know. And likely they will get rejected without review. But in that case, if I'm submitting to Science or Nature, whatever, just might as well try it. But definitely the strategy of, what do we think is maybe aiming a bit high but reasonable? Have done that several times. So yeah, it definitely fits with sort of things they've published. We're going to try it, see what happens. So for example, Journal of Neuroscience, which is a very strong journal, I've had some papers published there. We also submitted one that turned out wasn't quite sexy enough for JNeuro, but they have eNeuro, which is their open access publication that publishes solid science, but it doesn't have to be as novel a story. And there, your submission basically transfers over to eNeuro if it gets rejected from Journal of Neuroscience, if you want it to. So we aimed for JNeuro with one of the papers. It didn't work. We got a nice eNeuro paper out of it that's been cited several times. So that's been a bit of my approach to publication. I'll admit, this is something I've struggled with a little bit, is because my lab, like many of us, go kind of in waves for funding. We might have finished a project, but I used all the money to pay people to do the project. Now I'm going to be looking at a non-open access journal that doesn't have publication charges because I don't necessarily have the flexibility to pay a $2,000 or $3,000 publication fee. Whereas for projects where we have larger grants, rather than say small foundation or pilot grants, those projects I can afford to shoot a bit higher because sometimes those journals charge more. So there is a very real financial consideration as well. Now, more journals that are open access are also developing relationships with institutions for negotiated rates on publication. The old model was university libraries pay subscription charges for journals or family of journals, and then only people that have subscriptions can access those papers for free. Now with open access, the idea is that anybody should be able to read the science, but then it's really pay to play. So it's also looking at what my university has a negotiated rate with so that we can afford to publish in some of those higher journals. So a lot of different factors.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to raise one point, talk about one point that Barb brought up about the reviews, because yes, it's dealing with rejection all the time. That's part of what we do in science. But I think that there's a way as reviewers, and thinking about a lot of you who are now starting to review papers, either maybe on your own or with your lab, we do group reviews for lab meetings. Sometimes I'll get permission from a journal editor that for a paper I've been asked to review to share it with my lab members. And then we discuss it as part of lab meeting. That while those reviews are going to be highly critical, they don't have to be me. And I'm going to encourage this entire group, when you're reviewing papers, to write a review that is constructive without being cruel. Because just because not everything gets published, just because there are improvements that need to be made, that doesn't mean that we need to be jerks about it.
Can I just add amen to what Ali just said? And I also have I think we're at a point where it's really editors being lazy or sloppy if reviews contain kind of really cruel comments. I serve as an editor on for eLife, a senior editor at this point, and I do read the reviews for tone. And I have written to friends of mine and said, there's an entire paragraph in here that is just unnecessary. It has nothing but criticism and has nothing constructive, and it's inappropriate. And too often editors don't take that on because they don't want to embarrass themselves or but it's really the editor's job. And if you get bad reviews, bad in the sense of not being helpful, of being hypercritical or insulting, it is appropriate to write to the editor, copying the senior editor, the editor-in-chief, and say, this is inappropriate. It's not professional. I know it's easy to say also, but it's easy for me to say that as a senior person. I think if you're a junior person, you might feel that it's out of place or something. I would respect that also. But if you do feel an urge to reach out to an editor, you should feel allowed to. Even though I realize that it's easy to say that if you're in my position compared to untenured and a junior person. So.
Thank you so much, Barb, for doing that as a senior editor and for encouraging that. And yeah, especially if you're a graduate student or a postdoc and you get inappropriate reviews, really, it should be your PI that
exactly
contacts the editor. And if you have the sort of PI that doesn't necessarily see that situation in the same way you do, I think this is a good opportunity to then go to your PI and say, hey, I was at this mentoring session with spARO and I learned that you could do this. Do you think this is something that we could email or you could email an editor about? And therefore you're not saying, hey, I felt hurt, but it's like, hey, I learned this is a thing. Maybe even name drop Barb or myself or both and say, hey, do you think we could try reaching out to the editor? So you can always blame somebody else for an idea if you're not comfortable. Well, don't always, but if you're not comfortable taking ownership of that idea, you can bring in additional information to go to the editor.
And I do think the most senior person on a paper is the person who should reach out to the editor. It should not be on the younger person. But I mean, if you're the senior author, but still are fairly junior, you may not feel comfortable. And I respect that. It's not like you have a responsibility to take that on. It's not your battle, but don't take it personally. I did also pop in the chat a link to a thing that I think is awesome, jane.biosemantics.org, which you can plop in text and it finds the journal that might be a good, it's pretty good at finding journals that might be an appropriate place to publish just based on keyword matching. So it's another one of these crazy ass tools that are out there now. The other thing, this goes to
so cool. I didn't even know about that.
Oh, it's really fun. And you can also, so that's a really good fun tool. The other thing, when we really don't know what to do, we sometimes turn to Jane. But the other thing to do is look at who you're citing. Look at the reference list in your paper. Where are those papers being published? Because probably they're a journal that cares about the kinds of work that you're doing if the papers you're citing are published in that paper. And the other thing at this point in my life, I have a feel for what journals are going to react nicely to the kinds of work I do and what journals don't understand the kinds of work I do. Like if it's a purely psychophysics paper with no neuroimaging or anything, I'm not going to send it to a more neuroscience-y journal. I'd probably send it to JAZA if it's a solid, but not reaching kind of place to send it. So it really depends on that as well. It's some kind of seeing where papers like this get published so that it's finding the right audience. And the truth is, in today's age, it doesn't matter where a paper appears, in that it will be found because of the tools we have available to us. And it's really a matter of how much people credit it when it comes to like bragging rights more than anything.
Yeah, impact factor, right. Grant submissions, tenure and promotion review. Right.
People are still impressed by that kind of, like if it's in PNAS or, something higher level, then yeah.
But yeah, exactly. It's going to be found.
Yeah. Oh, the next one's Elise has a good one too.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, we can move on to that. What is your process for determining authorship/author order? Because yeah, that can have some variability. And have you ever had authorship conflicts, and how might you resolve it?
I'm at a point, again, I'm very senior now, and I'm at a point where I'm often the last author because it's work done in my lab with funding that I brought in, and I help in the design and am consulting, and I'm the senior person. But if I also have some fairly, senior-ish people in my lab who need to have credit. And if they're not going to be first author on a paper, and they are really involved in the design and taking on some of that leadership on the paper, I talk to them ahead of time about, if you want to take this project and be the final author on the paper, showing that you really were acting as the senior guide on the ideas, that's fine with me. I don't really gain much by having one more senior authored paper, but for them, it may make a big difference. But I've always tried to be generous early on. My first couple years as a professor, I really fretted about this and kind of got tense and butted heads. But honestly, it always helps to be generous rather than like trying to be stingy. And being generous has paid off dividends over the course of my career by having other people be generous back to me. So
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, authorship. Similarly in my lab, for the most part, I'm going to be senior author, last author, where the graduate student or the postdoc is going to be, or a senior technician, if they were the lead on the project, is going to be the first author. And then everybody else will be in the middle. If there was a second faculty member involved, but it was really my lab leading it, they would be second to last author generally. But we tried a model for one paper where I was first author, because this was 6 different people in the lab, mostly undergraduates, each doing their own piece, where I was writing the paper, I was first author. And after that, we just went alphabetical order by last name for everybody else, because everybody had done approximately equal work of doing, like, basically everybody was responsible for one figure. And so that was an experiment, and I think it worked. Oh, and some of them got me a mug with abstract on it and part of one of the figures.
I love it.
Because it was their first paper. They were so excited that they got mugs for themselves and for me, which is amazing. I do not expect gifts from my lab members, but I was so excited by like the nerdy mug.
Yeah.
In terms of conflicts, haven't had a lot of that, like with papers where it's multiple labs contributing. If they're usually, it'll still be one lab is taking the lead on a particular project, or if there are 2 where we'll maybe be getting 2 publications and there's 2 graduate students who are both really contributing. Like my lab does a lot more of the cell biology and imaging, and one of my close collaborators, Joe Cisneros, who's actually the other co-editor in chief now in the Shar series, his lab does a lot more of the electrophysiology, and we're co-PIs on a grant. So if it's an ePhys paper, his lab is first author and he's senior author, and I'm going to be in the middle with my lab members, and vice versa if it's my lab taking the lead. For papers that are going to be bigger, combining both, we would probably have a co-first author situation where a grad student from each of our labs will clearly be co-first authors. Sometimes you flip a coin to see who's going to actually, name's going to go first, or to be honest, who maybe has a more findable last name. If they're both clearly indicated as co-first authors, it is kind of random as to who's actually going to go first, if they really each did contribute equally. I did encounter one maybe minor authorship conflict as a postdoc, where I was doing a side project where my postdoc PIs were not really involved in that project. And they had both said, and they were clearly okay with that. But then one of them later on said, hey, I should be an author on this paper as well. And in that case, I then went back to the email where that person said, yep, this is okay. I do not need to be a part of this. I will not be on the author strike. So sometimes just having things in writing is also useful.
Yeah, that has a utility even beyond publishing. Having things in writing.
Having clear agreements.
I see a
Great
hand
question
raised.
for Barb. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's We have a great question in the chat that I'll move to after. There's a hand raised in Zoom, and I might give that a bit of a priority, and we can chew over the question in chat after Amelia.
Hi, everyone. I have actually a few questions. One is if you can after give us some tips on how to write a discussion. That for me, at least, it's the most tricky part. And the other couple of questions that I have is if, for example, we deal with co-authorship, like first author, so why we cannot flip the order? Could the community, the inner ear community, push editors and stuff to say, okay, these two people are co-first, why cannot flip in their CV? So if I'm co-first and just put in the second with, no reason, because we need to choose one, for example, so why cannot be flipped? And if the community can do some things. And the other things is, I noticed that inner ear in general, it's not always published on Science, Nature, or high impact factor journal. And we have a big community like regeneration community, for example, but they get in this kind of journals. So the reason is, do we have support each other enough in terms of colleagues reviewing? Because who is the reviewer of my paper will be a colleague of probably Alan, but in terms of a PI or some of the group. And so why to be harsh and not promote your community and say, you should have done this experiment or prove this and this, and reduce rejection? Because if I'm aiming for a high journal because I have a novel story or stuff like that, it's tough, right? It's not just a question that it's not sexy, it's just how the community inner ear can support each other to improve the science and not just be harsh and say, no, you know what, I never get a Nature paper, you will not get to. So this kind of mentality, how we can stop. And because other field like it's a sensory organ as well. So why they get, or other kind of organs that have similar story, but the community, the reviewer are much supportive each other, and they get this kind of often publications. And I think it's all for now.
So I'm going to just comment on your last comment. I actually think our community, the hearing community generally, is, if anything, more supportive than most communities. And I don't say that lightly. I've collaborated with many people. The field of vision, you mentioned eye, as if they're cutthroat. They are mean to one another. They're bickering and fighting. And I don't find that in the hearing field. I really think most of the actors in our community are supportive. It's a smaller community. And honestly, I think if there are differences in the number of large papers that get published, it has to do with the fact we're a smaller community. I think the number of vision scientists to auditory scientists is maybe a factor of 4, maybe more. Like, it's a large community. It's a much bigger group of people. And that leads to more infighting, I think. I think it leads to more protectiveness of territory and turf. And I think, but it also means there are more papers out there, and actually they're ahead in many areas of science. They're just a little bit ahead of us because there are more people working in the field. And so the pace of research is a little faster. So I think all of those things together, actually, I love being an auditory neuroscientist because of the support and the camaraderie within our field. If your experience is different than that, I'm sorry, and we can always do better. So I don't mean to negate what you're.
No. I do not have any experience yet, but soon I will experience some things, definitely, because I'm wrapping up my manuscript. So
Got it.
Yes.
Well, I hope you find that you will get constructive and supportive feedback. And
I hope so.
I do think there are a few people who think of themselves as gatekeepers, as reviewers, and that's a problem. And that is a real issue. But I think we as a community can talk about it and try and fight it by just discussing it and being open about it. And again, a senior editor or the handling editor can be the person who reins in the reviewers if they're asking too much. And I think a lot of editors or associate editors don't always step in when they have the power to do it. They feel like their job is to just collate information and pass it on, rather than step in and say, actually, the things you're asking are too much, or the things that you as a reviewer are asking somebody to do something that wasn't their original intent. That might be what you would have done, but what they have done is fine. It's just different than what you would have done, and that's okay. But you know that there is gatekeeping, and it's frustrating, and that's one of the problems.
I mean, and at the highest impact factor, so thinking about things like science and nature, there the gatekeeping isn't even our community. It's the editors there who decide whether something else even goes out for review.
Yeah.
So a lot of times a person in the auditory field will never see a paper that was submitted to one of those journals because the editor decided that it wasn't sexy enough.
And as a small field, usually the editors are not from our field. Usually the editors are a vision scientist or a hippocampus researcher or whatever it might be.
All right, trying to mentally back up to the other questions, and I'll admit my mental reverse process needs a backup camera. So
It
yeah,
was one about the co-authorship for if we are co-first, why we cannot flip in our CV. And
Amelia, there is nothing stopping you from writing it in the order that if there are two first authors and with asterisks in the written publication, you can flip it. And you can even at the beginning of your CV say, when in the case of co-first authorship, I have put my name first. Done. You've been
and indicate with an asterisk on your CV that you did that. Yep. Yeah.
There's nothing stopping you, and no one would give you trouble for that.
Exactly.
No,
Why
I mean,
wait for other people to invent rules? Just do it.
Yeah, it never happened to me, and I don't know if it will ever happen, but it was a question that was in my mind. And that the other was if you can give any suggestion on writing discussion, that at least for me is the most hard part, because results it's easy kind of, and methods too, but the most hard for me personally is the discussion, even because English it's not my first language actually, so it doesn't help maybe. But if you have any suggestion, I will really appreciate it. Thank you.
The discussion is, I think, the hardest part of any paper to write, period, anyhow.
Yes.
Breaking it into pieces always helps me.
Mm-hmm.
And I like a discussion that has sections that are very clearly labeled with a conclusion.
Yep, I was going to say the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then write what you need. So you've already described the results in the results section. You're going to have an introduction that kind of places this paper and kind of says where you're going to go with it. And then there's usually the first section, I just kind of regurgitate at a very high level what the results were, but with some interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I had a hypothesis coming in that's really straightforward and it was supported. Say that. But then I might have sections, and each section will be like, it might, a conclusion as a heading, and then a discussion of that idea. And it's hard for me to come up with an example, and maybe Allie, you can.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. And so I think when you're sitting down to write a discussion, there are a couple of different ways to do it. Like Barb said, like usually the first paragraph is going to be the big picture synthesis of your results with a little bit of interpretation. But then that little bit of interpretation can also then almost form like some of the headings for the next sections of your conclusion. So, for example, like my lab last year published a paper on the potential for some COVID drugs to damage hair cells. So and I'm maybe not remembering it exactly, but in terms of the order that we put things in the discussion, but the opening paragraph is going to be, here's our results. And then there'll be something about, say, damage mechanisms for these drugs compared to damage mechanisms that we know about for ototoxic drugs that are well characterized. So it's like, now we're comparing this part of our results to what's already in the literature. And that would then be its own subheading. And then there may be a subheading about like, hey, we got this really weird result. How does that fit in? Let's speculate a little bit, bring in more literature on this unexpected result. And then in this case, there would be a section on like, these are how some of these drugs are used. Here's maybe a cautionary note for clinical trials that are using some of these drugs. So how could this information potentially be applied? And of course, one of the things that we're going to be cautious of or going to do in our discussion sections is not just place our results in context, but also talk about what are some of the caveats, especially if our results don't necessarily agree with what's published or were contrary to our hypothesis, although that's the part when it gets to be really fun. Hey, we had this hypothesis. Check this out. We were totally wrong, but we found something really cool instead.
You learned more because it didn't work the way you thought.
Yeah, and that's when it gets to be really fun. But also this gets back to like the way that my lab approaches doing some of these things is we might have little bits and pieces of discussion, just a sentence or two here or there written as we're interpreting each set of experiments as we go. The other thing is, to be honest, my process, I don't necessarily have any papers sitting around right here that I can easily show off, but my process for writing discussion and introduction really is I sit down, I still literally sit down with like an actual like stack of physical printed out papers, mostly because I get sick of sitting at my desk and staring at a screen. And then I'll start reading and I'll start just physically writing notes in the margins of like, oh, right, I want to make this point in the discussion. Like I'll underline something and be like discussion point, and then like just put an arrow and like tie it in a few words into what we found and how these things relate. And then again, when I'm sitting down to write the discussion, I'm not even starting from scratch there because I'll find that I have like a third of the ideas already scribbled out on pieces of paper that I can start to put together. And when I start to put them together, I don't care if they all make sense and they're in any particular order. I just start sticking them down on a page. And then I'll even be like, hey, this point here connects to this paper here, and then need a few more sentences about this idea. And then I go back and fill it in. So one of the biggest things I think to writing anything, but particularly the intro and the discussion, are don't worry about actually getting the ideas all there. Screw sentence structure, just jot ideas down and then you flesh it out later.
And
Thank you for answering all the questions.
move things around, like be flexible and try and find an organization that is compact, breaking things into simple ideas.
Yeah. And that each section or paragraph is tying into the one before it and the one after that. And if it's not flowing that way, then you're going to need to go back and rearrange.
Yeah, I learned in track changes in Microsoft Word that you can toggle it so that when you move an entire paragraph, it doesn't count as a change. Because I would get an entirely red page because I'd be shifting paragraphs all over the
Everything
place.
would be new.
Yeah, but you can have it
That's
just,
fun.
I think, insertions and deletions are tracked. So I'm really excited by Kathy's question about eLife and about even a larger discussion about sort of bioarchive and preprints. But I think given the gravitas of that discussion, we might want to take a quick 10-minute break first, stand up, stretch, not look right at a computer screen. But when we come back, we will definitely address Kathy Sung's question and really get into that, because it's fantastic that we have you, Dr. Shinn-Cunningham, as an editor of eLife to talk about this. But let's come back at 5 minutes till the hour, giving ourselves just
Sounds
about
good.
I get more
break.
coffee. Thank you. I'll be right back.
So if you're interested, I can share some slides from eLife that talk better than I could by myself.
I think that is an excellent idea.
All right.
Yeah, that's really great. All right, as we start to come on back, definitely ask more questions in the chat. There's plenty of time. And the first one we're going to tackle is from Kathy Sung. eLife has started a new model for publication different from other journals. eLife is eliminating accept reject decisions after peer review. And mostly for Dr. Shinn-Cunningham, can you describe the goal of this change and the vision that eLife foresees moving forward with publishing?
So I've been involved in eLife from pretty much from its beginning. And I have to admit, I'm excited, but skeptical about how this experiment is going to come out. So I actually am going to be talking about this at ARO on a publishing panel at ARO in one of the sessions there. But this is a little preview because I wrote to eLife and I'm like, I'm going to give this presentation. You probably have some slides. So they sent me some slides. So the way it's going to work is people will submit just like they used to. The people who are senior editors like myself will read a paper and decide if we think not whether it's worthy of publishing or not, but whether we can give a review that would add to the community's understanding or not. That's kind of the criterion, and whether we have the manpower and appropriate people to ask to provide reviews, at which point it will get, if the answers to those questions are yes, then we will accept it to be reviewed. It will go through peer review, and then we will publish the reviews along with the paper. The authors will have a chance to respond, and at whatever point they feel the paper is done, they say this is, quote, a version of record. The published paper will then be like the paper can be accessed. It will have a DOI, and it will have accompanying it a set of reviews that follow it along that don't say it was accepted or rejected. So it's not like a stamp of approval. It's a stamp of assessment rather than yes or no. And really, the reviewed paper will look like this. It will have a little bitty brief summary that kind of says what the strengths and weaknesses are in a very high level. And the history of the paper review will be shown. All of the papers that go through this process you have to have them out as on bioRxiv or the equivalent before it can go through the review process. That's been true at eLife for a while now. And that's really it. So, and the rationale for it, well, there are a few things to say. The authors have a lot more power in the sense that it's not supposed to be so much about gatekeeping. It's supposed to be about adding value. And you can submit revised versions if you want and ask for re-review. And a new review will appear with the revised paper. And you can do that until you decide it's done. And you decide, this is the version, I'm done with this. The reviews stand as they are. This is the final one. And that's all. There'll be a way to be able to see, even if you land somewhere on the paper that's not the final one, you'll get pointed to the final one, et cetera. And the rationale really is the benefits that eLife is hoping will come are they elucidate here. So you'll get peer review versions of the preprint out quicker. You have more control as publishing because you're deciding whether to call it a version of record or not. Oh, and by the way, at any point in this process, if you want it to get published and accepted or not in a different journal, even after there's a version of record, you can send it to be published in a different journal. And so it's not like it's published. It's just got the reviews attached to it and has a DOI that can be referenced and reviewed. So it's supposed to streamline the process, supposed to give a kind of summary of the paper. And the reason for it, the hope is that it will get people to be promoted and funded based on what you're doing, not where it is published, whether it's got that stamp of approval from some high profile place. It's kind of amusing because eLife has been that kind of place, right? And now they're using that name to try and leverage change, which I kind of respect. Like I said, we'll see how it all turns out. It does try to fight this metricization of like, it's either yes or no, it's either you've got a science paper or not, whatever. And hopefully it will reduce sort of the exploitative practices from some of the publishing companies that are out there. So that's what I can tell you. I'm happy to field other questions, but like I said, I didn't design it. I'm not an expert in it, but that's what they're hoping for. So it's pretty weird. We'll see. And I mean, it's really funny too. I don't know how many of you are on science Twitter, but like when this announcement was made, the world went crazy for 2 days on Twitter about the science. Twitter went crazy. And people were like, it's still gatekeeping, but it's less gatekeeping than the world has been, like, yes, the senior editors can still decide not to send something for review because we just don't have the capacity or don't feel like we can add value by having it be reviewed. But, you decide when you're done. If the first set of reviews come back and they're like, you could have done this experiment and it would have been better if you'd added this, but you think that's good enough for you, you just say, I'm done. That's the version of record and that's it. You don't have to wait to pander to some reviewer that is making crazy demands.
So do you think in that sense, with what eLife has decided and also with preprints becoming more commonplace for other journals, do you think that is a general trend where most scientific publications are going to have some sort of preprint, pre-manuscript model?
I don't know, but I can say it is a trend that's getting stronger and stronger. I think the deluge of the amount of science that's out there is overwhelming. I think there's something good about some curation of science and, going to, there is something useful about that. And distinguishing truly predatory journals that will just take money and not really review the paper and yet make it look like it's been through a review process that is strong. I think that's a problem. And I think that this kind of approach with a reputable place that will review your paper and maybe it wasn't novel enough or groundbreaking enough that it would have been accepted in the old eLife model, but now what you will get is a little summary that says this is often the rejection letters that I would have to write as an eLife editor would be like, this is a really solid piece of work. It's a really interesting idea, but it doesn't really change our understanding in a profound way, which is kind of what we expect for this broad reach journal. And now what you would get is this is a great piece of work. It's a solid piece of work. It confirms other results in the field and is a nice contribution. If you had that, so it's supposed to be a qualitative assessment, and there's a lot of solid science that never made it through that filter because that curation of becoming that elite, high profile, kind of publication, it demands certain things that aren't about the quality of the science, but rather about whether what you found is surprising and interesting in a way that's shocking and changes how people think. Most science isn't that. Most science is confirmatory and more incremental, and that doesn't mean it's bad science or not important or didn't represent really good hard work.
That's really great, and even sounds like it would be a really wonderful model for that sort of incremental progress or replication even.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say, I think it's interesting in that a lot of my work before I started doing more neuroimaging, I was a psychoacoustician, mostly doing kind of straight up behavioral studies. And the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America doesn't do a lot of gatekeeping. If the methods are sound and the results are clear and you're not making overstatements about the data, it will get published, in my experience. But neuroscience, I think because there's so much that gets published, every journal to some degree rejects things just because they're not surprising or interesting in that sense. And a lot of work ends up in, journals that don't have great reputations because the higher profile, even modest impact factor places end up rejecting very solid work.
Mhm. We have some more questions coming in the chat. Samantha Davis asks, could you elaborate on making the decision between multiple, shorter, quicker, less exciting papers versus a large paper that builds over a long time span? And she's asking from a grad student perspective, but I'm imagining this can apply throughout.
Yeah, lumping versus splitting, right? Like classic question in evolutionary taxonomy, but also showing my background, but also applies to papers. And I don't have a single good answer for this. I'll offer some thoughts, and obviously Barb will as well. Least publishable unit, in my opinion, is not appropriate. Like, it shouldn't be like, oh, here's one little tiny paper, and here's one little tiny paper, and here's one little tiny paper. No, it should be part of a story that fits together with multiple connected pieces. But is that one really big story that maybe has some tenuous connections between parts of it, or two that are very concrete, solid, these stories each make sense on their own? We could link them, but it's not necessary, and maybe it doesn't even tell as cohesive of a story if we try to link them together. So that's part of it. Strictly speaking, practically, like, some graduate programs will have publication requirements of you need to publish 2 or 3 peer-reviewed primary research papers. So therefore, it's working with your PI and your committee and your collaborators to think about, like, what are those pieces that are solid stories, but it's not, let's build up to one big paper that's published right when you're defending or shortly after. So there are a lot of practical considerations that go into it. If you're applying for a pre-doc fellowship, say through NIH, which you're not eligible to receive, you can apply before you advance to candidacy, but you can't actually start the fellowship till you advance to candidacy. At least that used to be the requirement. I think it still is. That you're pretty much these days going to be expected to have a publication. So if you have a solid set of research, of experiments that you could put together into a nice paper, maybe you could spend another year and make it even bigger, but you have something that's really nice, submit it, get that line on your CV. That's going to help you get funding. So they're very practical considerations. Like, it's not all, oh, we're going to spend 5 years and then get this one great paper. Sometimes 2 really solid papers is exactly what you need to keep the research enterprise moving and to fulfill requirements, whether that's to your graduate program or to the funding body. So yeah, Barb, maybe you're from someone that's more senior, that's not like, oh crap, I need to get this out now before, like, I use up all the money.
Yeah, we get in that situation too, but I would add a couple things. It's really great to create a nice, big, beautiful set of work, but the problem is it can be too much for people to digest.
Yeah,
honestly. And you don't want to have some paper that by itself is incremental, and this piece by itself you could publish, but it would be incremental. But if you put them together, the conclusions you could draw would be bigger and more interesting. That's a reason to package the information together. But honestly, it's actually better. Your messaging is easier. The paper is cleaner and more concise. If you can, even if you have a big project, if there are 2 main things that you want to talk about, maybe it's, one might be about how performance changes over time, and the other might be, a manipulation between conditions at the end state of learning. I'm making things up. I don't know. Putting all of that in one paper can be so cumbersome that it just makes it really hard to communicate either of those stories well. And so breaking a big project into smaller projects, each of which has a really clear and easy to understand message is actually better. It's really funny. I was on a research call this morning with a former student of mine who's now a professor, and I've pulled him into a collaboration because we're doing something that's related to work that he's been doing. And he mentioned something that was in his PhD, his main paper from his PhD, and I'd forgotten that was even in there. Like, it was a figure. We pulled up the paper and we're looking at it on Zoom together. I'd forgotten it was there. It was part of his thesis that I directed, right? And it was buried in 17 figures, and it was an interesting point that I'd forgotten we even made because it was just too much, right? It wasn't the main story, but there was a nice little aside that I'd completely forgotten even existed. So there really is something to creating a nice, compact, concise paper. And I'm also I work with a lot of psychologists who tend to write papers where every introduction is like 7 pages long, and it's like a mini review. Wow, I don't want to have to write that. And I don't always want to have to read that. And if I'm going to write a review paper, great, but then it better be a synthesis of stuff, not just a regurgitation of all the facts ever about some topic. So I'm a big fan of a really short introduction that gets right to the point about people have said this, people have done this, but there's a gap or there's a controversy. I'm going to address it right on in and then answer that question. And if you have more data to show, that could be another paper with a different point.
It seems like it also relates to what you both mentioned about starting from figures or storyboarding it. If you have a story and you've sort of plotted out the number of figures, there might be a sort of critical number. You start going over that and it starts becoming a bit too large for the story that you want to tell, versus the paper has to have some sort of critical mass. It has to be more than 1 figure, maybe more than 2, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll get to a point where it's difficult to fit everything into one story. Like, it's similar with posters, right? Posters usually are not telling the whole story of a paper, and often shouldn't, even if they are, which is a whole nother point. But when you get to the point where you have more data than you can put on a single poster or in a single paper, that's a good thing. That means you've built up this body of knowledge that's connected in some way, but that doesn't mean you have to put it all in one place, because you will overwhelm the reader and obscure the main point.
Great. There's another question in chat from Ahmad. What are your suggestions about collaboration? How can we involve and collaborate with other labs? Should we discuss and ask our PI if we can collaborate, or is it better to directly email that lab's PI?
I think it's always good to talk to your own PI, especially if you're going to reach out to another senior colleague, because I like to know what my students are up to, what my trainees are up to. I would feel kind of weird if I found out that if they'd written to a friend of mine who I know really well, and I know what that person's working on, and I've talked to maybe even that person, and maybe even have plans to collaborate with that person, and my student reaches out without telling me, it's a little awkward. And on the flip side of that, I would hope that your PIs would be open to the idea of collaborating, but everybody does science in a different way, and there's no right or wrong here. There's just different styles, and some people are more collaborative than others. Some people play things really close to the chest. I have one collaborator when I was at Boston University. I had a collaborator who I love. I worked with him for years. He would not allow people to send posters to a conference unless the paper was basically written. He was not an auditory person. He was a visual person. He was afraid somebody was going to steal his idea. And that's how he played it, right? And so there were certain people he wouldn't collaborate with because he was worried they were going to steal his idea. And there was more truth to that fear than in our field generally. But he wasn't wrong, but it's not how I approach things. But I think I don't need to, because I'm in the field I'm in. So I think communicating with your PI is always important. If you can't, that's a sign your PI may not be a good match for you if you can't have that open communication. And again, it's not necessarily that the PI is a bad PI or that you're a bad trainee. It's just sometimes people don't mix well, and nothing personal, but hopefully you have a good relationship with your PI and you can talk openly about it and just say, I really would love to get some training in X. Is there somebody we could bring in to collaborate with to expand on our project? Because the PI wants to be part of it too, probably. They don't want to be left out.
No, definitely not. We don't want to be left out. And there is definitely an awkwardness if we hear from one of our colleagues saying, oh, I just heard from your trainee so-and-so. It's like, really? That I didn't realize they were reaching out to you. In terms of talking about collaborations, I mean, most of us are going to be at ARO in a week and a half, which I am going to be like a puppy. I'm going to be so excited. It's been way too long. But if you're talking to somebody at a poster, whether it's a PI or another trainee at a poster after their talk, and you've got some ideas, like talk about the collaborations at whatever level you want when it's just a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah.
But don't necessarily be committing to something. And actually, if it's, say, grad students and postdocs who are tossing around ideas, it's like, oh yeah, you're doing this thing and we're doing this thing. And you've got this really interesting behavioral assay that fits really nice with this electrophysiology work that we're done. I could see a great opportunity for collaboration. Then you can each go to your own PI and be like, hey, I met this person. They're doing this really cool work. I think would fit in really nice to ours. And often the PI is going to say, oh, I know their PI. That's a great idea. Or, oh, I didn't know about that. This is really interesting. Let's then, maybe, hopefully, if they're a good mentor.
I was going to say, there have been occasions where one of my students comes back from one of these meetings and is all excited like a happy puppy. And I'm like, that is, on paper, it sounds like a great idea, but I know that other PI and they're not somebody I'm really excited to work with for reasons we can talk about. So yeah, that's another reason why it's good to talk to your PI. If you have a good PI who you have an open relationship with, you can talk about the fact that some people aren't going to be as generous or nice or fun to work with. And the more senior people around you probably have a good sense of that.
Yeah. But if you come back and you say, hey, I just talked to this other graduate student, they've got these great ideas or they're doing something that really complements what I'm doing, then a lot of times your PI hopefully will say, that sounds great. How about you set up a Zoom meeting with their PI and them and yourself and your PI, and let's talk about ideas more broadly. I mean, if you're bringing ideas in that your PI is excited about discussing and maybe collaborating, that's a win-win.
Yep.
As a quick follow-up to that, I love the idea that it could actually start at the graduate student level, where you have trainees talking together and then it builds up to, hang on, we should bring the two labs together, or the two different dissertations that they're working on can be combined for like one collaborative project.
Do not look to me to generate every idea coming out of my lab. If you do that, you're going to be really disappointed.
And the other thing I'd say, the only way for the more senior I get, the only way a collaboration is going to happen is through a student or trainee who has the time to really spend on the science in a deep way and learn somebody else's approach in addition to learning what we're doing in my lab. That's what makes it happen. A postdoc, a student, a technician who has the energy and interest.
Yeah. We have a question from Minchul Park. What are your thoughts about some late career researchers going through the ethical dilemma of publishing just for the sake of publishing, marketing purposes, financial support, versus publishing because of scientific reasons? I feel we've been talking a little bit about some of the practicality behind publishing. So I think this really gets to the heart of that issue.
I'm having trouble imagining somebody publishing just for the sake of publishing, because you still have to have something that's going to get through peer review. Like you still have to have something that is useful. So I'm having trouble imagining being in that situation.
I guess where I've seen that situation is, say, an emeritus professor or two that are publishing reviews. And I've definitely seen that where it's at the end of their career and have ideas, are still interested in reading the literature and synthesizing information, but are not running a research program anymore. And I mean, sooner or later you get to a point where there are enough reviews on a given topic, but I think if a senior PI or somebody who's recently retired and become emeritus is interested in writing a synthesis review that is somewhat reflective, but also forward-looking, I personally don't have a problem with that. And again, it still does have to get through peer review. If they're just constantly repackaging data that they already had in different ways, then that's not appropriate. But again, that's something reviewers should catch. So it might be good here to have more concrete examples so that we can better address the heart of the question. And if I'm going to market the institution, I'm not going to publish. That's way too much work. I'm going to get on Twitter. That's what social media is for.
That's, that's a little bit not quite in publishing. There's still time for chat questions, but I feel like it's almost a different type of publishing as far as how does a lab potentially portray itself on social media. I know of one lab where like they write their lab's tweets by committee because they want to get a specific message out. And it's still a very, I feel, new concept for our field to have that really front-facing aspect of what you're doing.
Yeah. It's funny. I have a personal account and we have a lab Twitter account. And I have to say, first of all, Twitter was a lot more fun before Elon Musk bought it. A lot of people aren't on there anymore, and it's kind of a bummer. But I love it for not so much promoting our work so much as I really learn a lot from some of the different Twitter communities that I follow, like the Black and Neuroscience community. I've learned a ton from following what they say and understanding their point of view in a way that I couldn't if I wouldn't be in the room with them. It would change the dynamic, and I can just be an observer and listen and be respectfully watching to learn about their point of view. Or other groups like that where I learn from the discussion. I tend not to get, like Twitter can be a cesspool. Actually, I've found, because of the people I follow and the work that I look at, it's really kind of nice and supportive and gives me different points of view. So it's interesting. I haven't thought as much probably as Allie about the promotion side and the communication side.
I do use Twitter a lot for promotion, and that's true. In terms of and I have personal account, lab Twitter account, which I actually don't run. My lab manager is running that for multiple reasons, in part because me managing 2 different Twitter accounts was getting to be a bit of a headache. Thankfully, when I was briefly running ARO's Twitter account, I never tweeted something. I think I did accidentally retweet something as ARO rather than as me, but it was related completely to a paper that had come out in JARO or something. So it didn't matter, but it's so easy to get the wrong Twitter account on your phone. So I recommend only sticking to one. The other thing is specifically just for my lab manager, she's interested in going into a career in popular science writing. And so her running the lab Twitter account actually is a line on her CV that will help her in her next steps. So that is a very deliberate choice for her to get the experience that she needs. I mean, Twitter can be used for a number of different reasons. I'm really sticking to Twitter here. I think actually as a community, we should be spending more time on TikTok as well, but that's a whole nother discussion of getting our work out there. Like if you have a paper that's been published, post it on Twitter, tag ARO, tag here, use the right hashtags.
Tag the journal that published it.
We'll tag the journal, exactly. And sometimes they will put it out there and then you can just retweet it. Tag your institution so they know you just had something out. So it's also a good way to let your institution know what you're doing. But it's a great way for the people that follow you to know, oh, there's a paper that just came out that I want to read, or there's a really pretty picture somebody just published that or put on Twitter that's not part of a paper yet, but it's like, hey, they just got this amazing 4-color fluorescent image, confocal image. It's like, well, that's just really pretty. And I want to share it, not just with the scientific community, but with the, say, science art community. Twitter can definitely be a cesspool, but I think it can be used for a lot of benefit. The science communication community is really active there because we can also then put out some of what we're doing as scientists, but package it in a very different way to reach people that are on Twitter, but aren't ever going to read or shouldn't ever read have to read scientific journals because that's not their area of expertise, and it's ridiculous to expect that they would do that. So it is a great way to communicate a few of the high level thoughts about what we're doing, and to very deliberately build our online presence and our brand. Because it's not just that we're doing the science, but I think it's important for each of us to really think about what's our brand. And I'm not going to go into the details of marketing and brand right now, but that's an important conversation as well.
Oh, I almost wonder if that down the line could be a future spARO mentoring session. The idea of social media lab branding and marketing. I'll have to file that away and think about that.
George, I think that would be a
Fantastic.
great idea. I can tell you that there are, both at Boston University and CMU, run such sessions for faculty members. And honestly, it might be that you might want to have spARO run one of those for people of my generation.
Yep. I agree.
My gosh. Well, that's excellent. But I should focus instead on what our attendees are focusing on. There's another question related to the idea of previously published data. Are there ever cases where you find it appropriate to reuse previously published data, maybe reevaluate it in a new way? And can you do this if you are upfront about it?
In neuroimaging, it's super common. It's almost uncommon for it to not be reevaluated in different ways for different end goals. And I've done it, and it's not a problem. And as long as you're upfront about it, typically you don't have to write the methods out the whole time. You refer to the original paper, but briefly recap the methods so that people know what you did. And then, like Viva Viswanathan, who was a PhD student that I helped supervise, who just graduated a few years ago from Purdue, gathered some EEG data on some tasks and published a whole bunch of stuff on how the kind of stereotypical EEG responses change. She reanalyzed the data and has a paper now under review looking at the induced activity rather than the evoked activity. So looking at oscillations kind of in different bands and seeing how that correlated to some of the behavioral effects she was observing. Completely fine, not a problem.
Yeah, in my part of the field, I think it's a lot less common because a lot of the experiments that I do are on larval zebrafish, where we can sometimes run an experiment in a week. So it might be that we're running a new experiment that's similar to one that we already did and comparing it to a new genetic manipulation or pharmacologic manipulation. So yeah, I think a lot of it just depends on the field and the use. Definitely if you're doing some reevaluation to compare it to some new data, it's like, oh, I just got these new data, they're really interesting. Oh, I wonder if that phenomenon occurred in that experiment I ran previously, but I didn't look for it. Then yes, that's definitely appropriate. But yeah, just cite the work that you already did, make it clear that that work was already published. And check if they're like, don't just reuse part of a figure. You're definitely going to have to present it in new ways, unless it's a review or you're comparing new data to, say, one graph that you previously published. Then you're just going to need to make it very clear that that graph was already published. If depending on how it was published, the journal may own the copyright. So then you're going to have to go to them and get permission to republish it, even if it's your own work, if that graph was already published in that way. Because for the traditional kind of subscription model journals, they retain the copyright once it's published.
Can I say, though, that they don't own the data points, they own the picture of the data.
Right.
And if you ever are in that situation, just replotting it in a slightly different way avoids the copyright issue. And maybe it makes the point better than the original form of the graphic did.
Yes, absolutely.
They own the graphic, they don't own the data.
Right.
So we've gotten around that because I'm too lazy to ask for copyright permissions.
I think about copyright all the time, not in that sense, but this is really where the SHAR series comes into play. Because there, when we're asking authors to write review chapters, and they may be grabbing two panels from one figure in one paper and a panel from somewhere else and a panel from somewhere else, they're actually not replotting, and sometimes it's not even their own data, but they're synthesizing an entire chapter worth of information. We need to have copyright permissions for everything that has been previously published. So especially with those kinds of reviews, there you're not necessarily replotting data, and there the copyright becomes an issue.
Yeah.
We have another question about authorship from Kirthi Doraiswamy. Who has more weight, a person who collected the data or the person who analyzed it? One who did experiments will be an author for multiple papers, even when not involved directly, but usually not the otherwise. I suppose someone who maybe analyzed data that is then piecemeal in other places. The software developer / technician is usually not an author. Is it usually not seen as doing science, but just programming? So what's your view when, I guess, especially depending on the project or the size of the data set, you really have some specialization in the collection, the analysis?
This is one of those cases where in my lab, if the technician is involved materially in any of the, any of the work, they would probably be a co-author. So I just err on the side of inclusivity, and I don't think in terms of, I think there is a difference between just running the data, but even if somebody is just running the data, gathering the data, like in my lab, like somebody has an idea, and usually they're the person that programs it up to run. And then they may start running it and do some pilots. And then it's just, we need to get a bunch of subjects in. And I have a lab manager who will help get the subjects in, come in, and she's not a PhD person. She's a post-bac. She will be on papers when she's done a lot of the data collection. There's no reason to exclude her, but I don't view that as contributing as much as the ideas that go into, designing the experiment, writing the code. That's an iffy one, because in my lab, usually the person writing the code is the one who's been involved in the design, not just a program. I don't have a programmer on staff. I have people who program who are scientists in my lab. And the analysis is usually, again, that same person is analyzing the data. So I don't, that person who's kind of the lead is the person working with me closely to design an experiment, and then doing some piloting and then doing the analysis, even though they're not maybe doing all the data collection.
Yeah, and again, in my lab, it will be one person who really is doing more of the design, working with me, usually a graduate student or maybe a postdoc. I haven't had as many postdocs in my career so far, and they're the first author. They're the ones that are really leading the project. And there'll be a number of technicians, postbacs, undergraduates, even high school interns that may be part of that project. And I've had multiple high school interns as co-authors as well. Actually, the first high school intern, when I started my lab, reached out to me with an idea for a project. In that case, she wound up as co-first author, because I wouldn't have even done that project if she hadn't come to me with an idea that made sense, that was doable in my lab. And then she spent like 2 years running the experiments. So to me, authorship is, if you're doing some work, you should be getting credit for authorship. Like, even if somebody's running experiments with known protocols in my lab, they're still making decisions on the fly about, I want to image this region of the fish versus this region, or I'm going to tweak this protocol a little bit because I think I can get the labeling a bit more clear, or I'm going to pick this other fish line that has this different fluorescent marker. I mean, those are scientific judgment decisions that all contributes to the story and to authorship. If somebody's just saying, a technician shouldn't be an author, I think that they're old school and maybe should rethink things.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Are there any additional questions that people might want to submit to chat or raise your hand in Zoom to ask? We've covered quite a variety and breadth, I think, of publishing topics, everything from conceptualizing the paper to promoting it on social media. So it's been a really fantastic discussion with a lot of great insight and advice from both of our speakers.
This has been fun. It'd be more fun in person, but we're going to be in person soon.
Yeah, just not even 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, a week and a half. Yeah. Long overdue.
It occurs to me that I should put in a plug also. On Friday, my colleagues here in Pittsburgh and I are running another online afternoon cognitive neuroscience conference. It's called SCAN. And I can find the link. I should have looked it up. But it's a set of, we have a set of 3 speakers, each giving kind of brief, high-level talks, lots of interaction on Slack and on in the chat during the presentations, and everyone is welcome. And we especially are interested in involving young investigators and are really good about prioritizing questions and comments from young investigators. So if you give me a second, I'll look it up.
All right. And I'm going to
Nice.
start a couple of shameless plugs as well. You'll hear about this a lot more from me. We already talked about the spARO session on science communication, which I think all of the organizers of that are on this call as well, which is great. That's going to be Sunday from, is that 6 to 7, 5 to 6? Please refresh my memory. What time am I supposed to be there?
It might be the 4 to 6 time slot. I
It's
know
only
that's
an
like-
hour.
Oh,
Might be 5 to 6, but it's only 1 hour. And I think it might fall during the Super Bowl, which, to be honest, is kind of a stupid time to have anything, but we'll make it work. In fact, I think I'll probably bring in an improv game that involves, throwing a pretend football. So we'll see what happens. But that should be a ton of fun. This isn't coming for another year and a half, but the next Gordon Research Conference in the auditory system, which is July 2024. So be looking out for information for that, like next ARO. And then I'm going to also throw in a link for the Association of Science Communicators. Our upcoming Science Talk conference is in April. So anybody that's thinking more on the public communication side of science side of things, we would love to get to know you. Okay, workshops from 6 to 7. Cool, thanks. See, I have it written down. I just don't remember. Like, I know what I'm doing today. Beyond that, I got to look at my calendar.
fantastic. There's one last question, I guess, to finish up. If you could give a piece of advice to yourselves when you were just starting out, what would it be?
Ooh.
Write crap and edit later.
That's a good one. Be kind to yourself and forgive yourself for what you can't get done.
Oh, that's good advice. Now I see. Lobster life coach, right? This is what life coach in general. This is why I still need you.
Oh, that's
There is one
excellent.
question from Rebecca that came in the midst of all of me spewing garbage into the chat about reviewer side best practices.
Oh, you're right. Yes. Being on the reviewer side, best practices or suggestions for providing meaningful feedback.
When I'm reviewing, I tend to write down a lot more than I actually put into the final review. I will note a bunch of things, and then I will, as I go back through, as I'm synthesizing the review, because again, I'm taking notes as I'm reading the paper, I'll think about, does this really matter? Like, is this something that I really think the reviewers or the authors should address? Or is this, that's my personal preference, but it doesn't matter? Or is it, I wouldn't have worded it that way, but what they wrote is fine, versus what they wrote obscures the meaning and I had to read it 3 times and I was confused. So I think I should bring that to their attention. Or am I bringing in a paper I think that maybe they've ignored because I wrote it? Nope, that's not going to be right unless it's like the one authoritative paper on the subject. Or is it, there's a seminal paper in the field that I thought they should have referred to that addresses the question that they're addressing. And so I would suggest that. So thinking about the kind of intentionality of why I'm recommending some of the things that I'm doing. And again, keeping it positive. So, or at least constructive, starting out. And this gets back to my experience in Toastmasters as well, which is a public speaking organization where when we critique each other, it's a sandwich method. What's something that we did well? What's something positive? Here's some meat. Here's some suggestions for improvement. But then let's also end with, and maybe don't always do this in a review, but end with a positive. But I start positive, like, this is an interesting study. It contributes in this way. I saw value here. And then I might say, but I have some concerns that make me a bit less enthusiastic about the paper. And here are some of those concerns. And maybe here are some suggestions for addressing those concerns in a constructive way. So writing a review that you yourself could handle reading as the author.
Yeah. I echo everything Allie just said. Constructive, to the point. This is when I always print something out, or now will write on a PDF on my iPad, notes in the margin.
Mm-hmm.
And I when I'm reading, I get annoyed by bad grammar or like really indirect statements, and I'll like scribble, oh my God, this is so awkward. But that's not something I'm going to end up writing down in a review. Like, that's just my preference, and I get it out of my system by complaining on the PDF. When it comes to how I write the review, again, start positive, like Allie said. I'll then have, if there's a major criticism, I'll point out that major criticism, but I'll, try to be as gentle as possible and is not as non-personal as impersonal as possible, as factual as possible. If there's a really major flaw and I think the paper is really as written not gonna cut it, then I'll stop there. But if the paper is good, I might say this is something that you might want to, that probably you should take into consideration in the discussion. I really think you should address that. But then I will have some nitpicky little things that really are just about style, and they can take or leave. And I'll have a section that says, these are just suggestions for your sake. You can ignore them if you want. But I found, the third paragraph, there's a run-on sentence that maybe you want to break it up, and, things like that are editorial suggestions that really, it's not the paper, like the paper should be published regardless, but style-wise, maybe they would benefit from.
Yeah. And again, like, if it's a good paper, I will also maybe offer, like, if I think that the study is interesting and well conducted and I don't have any major concerns, I will still usually have like a major concern section of like, here's some things to think about. Like, I think that the discussion could synthesize the literature more. Here's a few suggestions, or I wanted to know more about this particular aspect of your study. And then it'll just be minor comments. And sometimes the minor comments are suggestions. Sometimes it's like, you referred to panel or to figure 3 before figure 2.
Yeah.
You might want to, which you're not really supposed to do. I wouldn't say it that way, but it's like, I think you could reverse the order of those figures. And so things like that are just like pretty easy to deal with. Or like, you don't have a scale bar on that panel. Could you please add a scale bar?
Yeah.
And so those things, and those are the things as an author, right? That when you're going back through, you're like, I can check off half the things on this critique in like an hour because they're little things. And I need to add a sentence with my sample size to the figure 3 legend. Check, done. Right. So those things are easy to address. In terms of what do you do when you have concerns about the submission? A lot more journals these days have the sections on their web form for comments to reviewers and then confidential comments to the editor. And that's when you use those confidential comments to the editor. And there have been times when I've reviewed a paper that I said, I've done similar experiments and I have concerns about their error bars because I've run similar experiments in my hands, in my lab's hands. Our error bars are always 2 or 3 times larger than what I'm seeing. And theirs all look to be the same across figures. I've seen that before. And so that is something that I will raise in the confidential comments to editor. There was one when we'd reviewed his paper as a lab for lab meeting, and then we got essentially the same paper submitted through a different journal, and I was asked to review it again. And that's when, and I'd had comments before. I didn't say outright reject. There were things that I thought could be improved upon. And that's when I just got in touch with the editor and said, here's my reviews from last time.
And let me just say, I've had that too, Allie. There's nothing more frustrating than going to the effort of really reading a paper in detail, pointing out what is actually a major thing that should be addressed. Not that it's, unaddressable, but it needs to be considered. And then you get the paper from a different journal and they haven't taken into account your previous criticisms.
Yep.
Holy cow.
Yeah, that's a great way to get a paper rejected, because you've just really annoyed a reviewer that hopefully spent a bunch of time giving a thoughtful critique of your work.
Yeah, that's rough, because like that reviewer, that's someone in your field. That's someone you're going to be seeing in the future.
And I know that person did it. They don't know I saw the paper probably. I don't sign my reviews when I'm just a reviewer. I just don't think there's any value to it. I know other people have different arguments. I just don't see that it's necessary. I try to be equitable and fair, and I don't think it's important, but that's the other thing to think about. Like, if you pull that kind of stunt, it's a small field and somebody's likely to see it again, and you should have dealt with the criticism.
The signing reviews is an interesting one. So the Frontiers family of journals, once a paper is published, the reviewers' names are made public. And that's very clear when you're a reviewer for those journals, which is interesting. Sometimes you do get contacted by a reviewer. I mean, I do remember my first paper when I was finishing up my master's thesis. One of the reviewers, we actually had to go to the editor and have a discussion, because one of the reviewers did sign his review and basically said, hey, I think they should have done X, Y, and Z, and I'd be happy to work with them on that. And I'm like, we invited you to collaborate 2 years ago. You said no. And now that there's a paper done, you want to collaborate on this? No. So that's when we went to an editor and said, here's what's going on. So sometimes as the author as well, you're going to go to the editor. But I mean, as a reviewer, basically, it's just be respectful, write the sort of review that even if you think there are really real concerns about the paper, that you would be okay reading.
I see, Amelia, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can comment or share your opinion if reviewers should be paid, and in case, why yes or why not, and if there is any step forward on this direction from journals, regardless of Eli or other journals, if they are thinking that this can improve the quality of the reviewer in terms of, more viability and so on. Thank you. That's
a great question. I don't know if it'll improve the quality. It would probably improve the timeliness. And maybe like if you review a paper within 2 weeks, we'll give you a small honorarium, versus if it takes you 6 weeks, you don't get that. There is some incentive there. But yeah, what are your thoughts, Barb? Because
it's interesting. I have really interesting thoughts about pay for work, free labor that's not compensated. I have a trainee in my lab who was asked to give a talk and was upset that they weren't going to get an honorarium for giving a talk. And in my experience, I would have been thrilled at that point in my career to be invited to give a talk and have my expenses paid. And the argument that was made was it's free labor, and it happens to be, I won't go into more details, but it is a generational thing that I hear more and more about, all unpaid labor. But in my mind, speaking now as a senior faculty member who runs a neuroscience institute, I am paying my faculty in my institute to become world-class scientists and get out there in the world. And part of the way you do that is by engaging with your peers, including reviewing, including giving talks. You're advancing your own career by going to give a talk, for instance. You're advancing your own career by participating in NIH panels, review panels, where you're getting paid, some tiny pittance of $100. You're getting paid, but it's not enough to even pay for the extra coffee that it costs you. You know what I mean? Like, it's not enough to make it worth it for the pay. But I'm paying you. I'm paying you to be the top in the field, or, to excel in your field. And that's part of the expectation, and that's part of getting your name out there. And these, it's free labor, yes, and it can be abused, yes. And you know, as a woman, as a person of color, you know, there are groups that are leaned on more than normal for some of these asks. So being judicious and saying no is fine, but if you are asked to do something that you aren't going to get something from, then say no. If you are asked to do some free labor, but it's actually going to benefit you, then say yes. But your job often is being paid to communicate the science. And by the way, I also feel if you take a grant, or if you're working on a grant or have a fellowship, somebody's invested money in you to do science. And part of that, the science in a vacuum means nothing. It's only important. It only has value to the world if you communicate it by giving a talk, by participating. When it comes to the review process, the whole system depends upon us giving our time, yet there are a lot of publishers making a lot of money. And that's why, again, I think the eLife example is actually an interesting example. eLife pays me as an associate, as a senior editor, some medium, it's like $1,000 a year or something, or, it's not a ton of money. It's real money though. Like, it's enough to matter and make me feel happy that I'm doing it. And they pay the board of reviewing editors. They don't pay the people who do the individual reviews, but I don't think they do. I can't even remember it. I don't think they do, but there is a pay scale, and for the people who are doing a lot of heavy lifting in that model. And I think that's a good thing. But, I don't review for Elsevier because Elsevier makes a ton of money, charges a ton of money for subscriptions, and they have a lot of good journals, but I kind of find it offensive that they are using my labor to make money rather than the eLife model where they're using money to publish things and do things for the community. That's my rant. I'm like an old curmudgeon.
No, I think you do bring up a good point there. One of the things that I think about when I'm asked to review a paper is, and I definitely turn down a lot of review invitations and a lot more than I used to, is would I want my own paper to be reviewed?
Yeah.
So to me, it is sort of I will do the work of reviewing because I also need somebody to review my own papers to have them published. So it is very much part of the system. I agree that the journals that are making a ton of money, that is definitely a concern, and there needs to be change in the publishing model to deal with those kinds of journals. But yeah, it is an interesting question.
Wonderful. I know I had said previously, like 10 minutes ago, oh, this is the last question, but we got just a few more and we got some really great discussion out of it. But that will about wrap it up for the spARO virtual mentoring session on publishing. Thank you to both of our speakers for your time and for the fantastic discussion. And thank you also to all of the participants for your inputs and your questions.
Yeah, so many black squares with names that I recognize. Like everybody turn on your cameras for a second if you can and just like wave at each other, right? Because it's been a long time since some of us have seen each other. And I don't like black squares. I like real humans. There we go. People, see people.
And we're going to see these faces in a little over a week. Yeah.
At least two-dimensional, flat humans that we will be seeing each other in 3 dimensions soon. So
hopefully, hopefully many of you will be there.
Yes. Come find us.
But thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful day. And thank you again to both of you.
Kathy, you're forgiven for your broken.
Yeah. And we'll see you soon, Kathy. Bye.